Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us virtually. I'm Austin Frerick, Deputy Director of the Thurman Arnold Project, an antitrust initiative at Yale University, and co-organizer of today's event. I want to give special thanks to my co-organizer, Rebecca Morris, the Executive Director of the Law, Ethics, and Animal Program at Yale Law School, and the sponsoring organization of today's event as well. I also want to thank our conference assistant, David Townley, and LEAP Programs Fellow Noah Macy, as well as our student co-chairs, Melody Wang, Manny Rutenall, and Alexander Wise. Special thanks as well to the Poitner Fellowship for their financial support today, and our faculty supporters, Fiona Scott Morton, Doug Kaiser, and Jonathan Laborn. Before we get started, I want to share a few logistical notes. The conference guide on the event webpage is your one-stop source for all the conference participant bios, abstracts, and a full schedule. We decided to move things at a brisk pace today. Each panel will start at the top of the hour and will feature 3 papers. The first half of the hour will include presentations on each paper by the author for about 10 minutes each. The second half of the hour will be a Q&A guided by the moderator, but ending 5 minutes before the hour to allow for a quick break. If you want to ask a question, please message the moderator in the Zoom chat or click the raise hand button. We will break for lunch at noon Eastern and start again at 1 p.m. We expect to conclude by 5 p.m. And follow along on Twitter using the hashtag #BigAgConference. And on a personal note, I want to thank my family in Iowa for joining us today, even though they got a bunch of snow yesterday. The American food system is at a crossroads. Our food system has undergone a dramatic transformation over the past 40 years. This laissez-faire deregulation era has paved way for power to become concentrated to an extent we've never seen before. As a result, the American food supply chain, everything from seeds to baby formula, has fallen under the control of a few multinational corporations, leaving family farmers and small and local businesses in the sector fighting an uphill battle just to stay afloat. The impact on the food we eat and on the communities we live in has been profound. The path we're currently on offers a grim future. Family farms that have managed to survive previous waves of consolidation will disappear, replaced by corporate farms with owners who live in Chicago, New York, and Beijing, and who have no loyalty to these communities. With millions of dollars in subsidies from a farm bill built for Wall Street, these farms will focus single-mindedly on growing 1 or 2 commodity crops for the manufacture and processed foods, or to feed animals that never see a blade of grass. The emergence of driverless tractors will give these land barons the power to replace farmers. All labor will be performed by workers who are poorly paid and easily replaced. Any crop that does not lend itself to automation will be offshored to developing countries that are willing to look the other way on labor and environmental standards. Our fruits and vegetables will be drenched in chemicals, picked by children, and shipped to us from halfway across the world, emitting carbon as they travel. Local restaurants face the same fate. They will continue to be replaced by cookie-cutter chains owned by multinational corporations based in tax havens. If a diner or coffee shop holds on, they will be dependent on the same handful of conglomerates for supplies, including some who might own their competitors. The unequal bargaining power means they don't stand a chance to get ahead. No one will feel the impact of these changes in the food system more than its workers. As power consolidates and the drive for profit leads corporations to seek ways to cut costs based on the recommendations of outside consultants and vulture capitalists, they will need even more on their employees to bear the burden. These workers will face low wages and grim conditions, just like the ones Upton Sinclair described in The Jungle. The food system was once a pathway to the middle class. Those are gone. Shrinking paycheck means that more Americans will be forced to rely on food made in factories instead of fields. For most people, the only option will be to consume cheap processed food from vertically integrated companies like Walmart. People who can afford to spend more may try to buy what they perceive to be authentic and local, but even if it's what's available, it's just a different brand with a higher price made by the same handful of companies. A person's income will increasingly be reflected in their waistline, another marker of haves and have-nots. As society bifurcates, we will continue to lose any sense of mutual dependence and shared responsibility. The political power of the biggest corporations and wealthiest interests will grow in lockstep with their economic power. They will use this power to further diminish the responsibilities to the communities that they operate in. People who live in these communities will be pulled further to the extremes as they feel less power over their economic and political lives, and their faith in the system erodes. As they have throughout history, demagogues will emerge to exploit the situation by scapegoating minority groups, giving people an outlet for the anger and powerlessness that they feel. You don't need a crystal ball to see the future because it's already happening, and it's only been accelerated by COVID-19. But it would be a mistake to assume that we've hit rock bottom, or that market forces, or that choices of consumers will somehow lead to a change in course. Without real structural change, all of the trends we've seen take hold will only intensify. It's important to acknowledge that we are still in the midst of this transformation, not its logical endpoint. To avoid this future, we need to address the root of the problem. The American food system has always featured imbalances of power. Family farms in places like Iowa built their American dream on land stolen from Native Americans. Southern agriculture was rooted in slavery, and Black farmers were excluded from the farm bill crafted during the New Deal. There is no perfect moment from the past that we can recreate. If we keep moving in the same direction, we know where the road leads. But the silver lining of this moment is that we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to choose a new path. A system that respects labor, animal welfare, economic liberty, competition, and our climate. That is the goal and hope of today's conference. It is time to turn the page by building a food system that reflects our values. Above all, that means that we can no longer conduct policy in a manner agnostic to power. Change won't come with your fork. It happens by challenging corporate power. And on that note, it is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker. Leonard is one of the leading American voices about the concentration crisis in the American food system. His first book, Racket, The Secret Takeover America's Food Business, is a gold standard for explaining how America's food system got to this point and what it means for society at large. Since publication, he has continued reporting in this space on everything from chicken price fixing in Bloomberg Business Week to fertilizer concentration in his second book, Kochland, The Secret History of Koch Industries and Corporate Power in America. It is my honor now to turn things over to Chris. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, Austin. Can you nod? Can you hear me okay? All right, that's great. Thank you so much for inviting me to this, and thank you for that really eloquent introduction, which I think is great in that it draws together so many of the really important threads that are involved in this issue. This isn't just about economics, it's also about our political landscape, it's about democracy, it's about the shape of our country, and I think you brought that together really well. And I'm so grateful to be here to get to talk. And more than anything, I'm just really grateful that a group like the Thurman Arnold Project would convene a discussion like this and focus on these critically important issues. This is a wildly important topic. I remember I used to tell my editors at the Associated Press that the issue of concentration in agriculture is really only important to people who eat. Other than that, it's kind of a trivial matter. And that's incredibly important. And it's true now more than ever, which I know is kind of a cliche to say. But one point I want to hone in on that Austin made is that in all sincerity, we are at a very ripe and unique moment in regards to these issues. You know, I published a book about concentration in the meat industry called The Meat Racket in 2014. And an author should never say this, but here you go. My book is in many ways now out of date. Everything has gotten much, much worse since I published it, which is surprising to me. Honestly, I thought I was describing a pretty dire situation, but conditions on the ground have worsened dramatically. But, and I'm not just saying this to kind of add some kind of rose-colored hue to this discussion. People who know me know I'm not in the business of rose-colored hues or tints. The reality is, there's a moment of energy, attention, and momentum around antitrust reform that we have not seen in America since the late 1930s. actually when Thurman Arnold was head of the antitrust division under the FDR administration in the late 30s, toward the second phase of the New Deal, they really engaged in years of vigorous antitrust reform that set the table for the American economy of the 60s, 70s, 80s, when in agriculture we had dynamic competition. There's a discussion today around looking at monopolies and monopoly power that I have not seen in my 20 years of reporting in this space. So I do think that this is an incredibly important conference. What's going to be talked about today has a profoundly meaningful potential to change things. So with that in mind, let me talk about what I've found through my reporting. To be blunt, it's a bit intimidating to talk to an audience like this. We have some of the sharpest legal minds in the country. We have people engaged every day in this business. We have academics who've been studying this topic for decades. The papers that are going to be read today are really breathtaking in their excellence. Here's what I think a reporter can contribute to this is a little bit of vision of some of the ground truths of what's going on out there and what the situation looks like, because that's really how I came to the story. So if I could, please, let me frame what I see as the situation and what I saw as a reporter covering this. I didn't write the meat racket because the meat industry is some crazy, extreme example of a business that has been consolidated. The meat industry, in fact, is emblematic of what is happening across fields in our food system. And in fact, it's what's happening across fields in telecom, the internet, eyeglasses, pharmaceuticals. We are hearing more and more about consolidated businesses where monopolies dominate production. It is an urgent issue today, and it has been urgent in our food system for decades. I'm thinking of the Missouri crowd who's on here today. Mary Hendrickson, a scholar who's been studying this. Bill Heffernan's been studying this. I don't want to say the food system is a canary in a coal mine, but the consolidation there is longstanding and extreme, and we can examine the deeply damaging effects of it, okay? So in the meat industry, we see this clear as day. You know, back in the 1970s, in that era I was just talking about, when we had something in the United States called antitrust enforcement, about 38 very large companies controlled half of the national market for chicken. In other words, there were 38 large industrial companies that produced about half the chicken in the United States. Today, two companies control that share of the market. They are Tyson Foods and Pilgrim's Pride, which Pilgrim's Pride is just a division of a very large conglomerate called JBS, as you know. That's an unprecedented level of consolidation. As I'm going to talk about, it's not just consolidated by market share, but by internal control, what we'll call vertical integration, which I'll get into. In the beef industry, we see a similar example. The latest numbers I saw say that 4 companies control roughly 85% of the cattle beef market. That's an unprecedented level of concentration. In the hog system, you see the exact same shape and form of the business, consolidated, tightly controlled by a handful of corporations. I came across this story by accident as a business reporter, more or less minding my own business in the Midwest during the 2000s, when I was assigned to go cover a story in a small town called Waldron, Arkansas, which is home to a massive but typical Tyson Foods complex. So if I could quickly, let me please describe how Tyson Foods works today. Tyson Foods is the largest US meat producer, but it is also a pioneer of the consolidated model we see today. So when you go into a little town like Waldron, you see what appears to be a normal small town. You've got the main street, you've got the restaurant where folks are, having breakfast outside and talking and having coffee. But just north of that small grid is an enormous industrial facility that slaughters roughly 1 million chickens a week. Truckfuls of live chickens go in one end, processed frozen chicken McNuggets come out the other end. What's amazing is that Tyson Foods owns all the means of production. It's a vertically integrated system. And by that, what I mean is all these businesses that used to be independently owned, independent businesses in rural America are now under the silo of one corporate owner. Tyson Foods owned the slaughterhouse in Waldron. It also owned the massive feed mill that bought grain by the silo to mix and feed to animals. It owned the trucking company that orchestrated this tight network by taking the birds to the farm, picking them up, bringing them back, taking the finished product to the warehouses. Tyson owned the enormous hatchery where millions of birds could be raised every week and sent out to farms. And as I'll discuss more, Tyson didn't own the actual farms, but tightly controlled them under a contract farming system that has really become, and is more and more becoming, the norm in rural agriculture. So fine, the industry is industrialized, it's tightly coordinated, it's centrally owned. So what? When my book came out, I was, called a person who just sort of hated progress. I mean, this is progress, right? To have a big, well-orchestrated machine that can make meat cheaper than ever. What really got me in this story was seeing how the farmers live, and it is emblematic of how workers live, and frankly, how consumers are treated within this system. When we say farmer today, it's a misleading statement. We're actually talking about small factory owners. Your typical farmer who raises chickens on a factory farm might borrow $2 million from the bank to build an industrial footprint of 7 giant warehouses with automated ventilation systems and feeding systems and watering systems that are controlled by computer. You might have 200,000 animals in one of these barns at a time. These are large scale operations. And what struck me when I went to Waldron was how profoundly powerless these farmers really were. I was covering a story that Tyson was delivering diseased birds to these farmers. And it was the farmers who suffered the financial loss from that and were driven out of business with no recourse because of a mistake that Tyson has made. And this was the tip of the iceberg. For example, farmers who raise birds under contract for a company like Tyson Foods, they aren't paid a rate per pound like most farmers. I found out they're paid under a tournament system whereby Tyson ranks the farmers against one another. And the farmers who raise the fattest birds on the least amount of feed get a bonus payment. But critically, that bonus payment is taken out of the paycheck of their neighbor who might not have performed as well on a flock of chickens. So what the tournament system does is ingenious in its way. It systematically divides farmers from one another, and it shifts the risks, the financial risk of raising birds onto the farm level. This stunned me. I had never seen a system like this before. In my mind, it entirely flies in the face of what we think about when we think about the rural economy. Sort of independent farmers, entrepreneurialism, and all the rest of it. And I will never forget a conversation I had with an elderly woman on the outskirts of Waldron. We were sitting on her front porch, middle of nowhere, and she was literally scared to mention Tyson Foods or even talk about it. We were 10 miles from the nearest cell phone tower. That's real power. And I wanted to discover, how did we get to this place where one company can have this much power over an entire rural community? Retaliate against farmers it doesn't like, put them out of business. Tyson Foods does that. I wanted to understand the system. And I got a bit of a lucky break, actually, on that front. After these interviews, I was up in Fayetteville, Arkansas, dining at a restaurant I really love called Carnal Hall. I recommend it if you're ever in town. And I'm eating, and the owner stopped by my table and said, "Hey, what are you doing in town?" We hadn't known each other. And I said, "Oh, I'm reporting on Tyson Foods." And he said, "Oh, well, he's right over there." What he meant by he was Don Tyson, the pioneering business genius, I would say, who built the Tyson Foods empire, was having lunch in the corner. And as a reporter, this was quite an opportunity. So I patiently sat there. I didn't know it, but Don Tyson was having lunch with the top attorney from Tyson Foods, the former top attorney, Jim Blair. I watched them finish 2 to 3 bottles of wine. Must be nice. And waited. And as Don was leaving, I stopped him and said, "Hey, Mr. Tyson, I'd love to interview you about your business. I think you could teach me a lot." And he said, "I don't talk to reporters after I've been drinking," which I got to say, good rule. I recommend everybody follow that rule. So he said, "Come by my office tomorrow and we'll talk. Here's my assistant's number." So I thought I'd been blown off. But the next day I called Don's assistant, Raylene. I met her at the front door of Tyson Foods headquarters. She led me back through the executive suite. I walked past the current CEO of Tyson, Dick Bond, back into the small office. There's Don Tyson sitting there in a Hawaiian shirt. And he says, "What do you want to know?" Well, so began an inquiry into how the system got built and how it operates. I'll just give you a couple headlines. That tournament, well, let me put it this way. Don Tyson grew up in Springdale, Arkansas during the Depression, hard times. When it comes to business, this guy was merciless. He felt like he didn't know anybody anything. Business is business. That is wrapped into the DNA of these companies. These corporations are going to operate in their self-interest to maximize profits for themselves and their shareholders. That's how life works. The reason Tyson had a tournament system, as it was described to me by the people who built it, was that they did want to systematically divide the farmers so they couldn't unionize. And furthermore, they wanted farmers to be constantly on edge so they'd have to borrow more money to reinvest in those warehouses I just described to Tyson's benefit. That's what the tournament was built for. The whole reason farmers are independent is because Tyson didn't want to own the farmland. So it created this contract farming system. What I'm trying to say is that the people who operate these businesses are operating in their own self-interest. When they write contracts, they're going to write them in their self-interest. Fine, that's capitalism. But here's what happened. Don Tyson told me he had a saying called expand or expire. Buy your competitor or go out of business. Go big or go home. This is the strategy that dominated Tyson Foods business through the late 70s and certainly through the 80s and 90s. This is when we saw an unprecedented wave of consolidation in our agriculture system. Okay, this is when we went from 38 companies to 2 companies controlling half of the chicken market. There's so many great books on this. The reality is, during this period, American antitrust policy fundamentally changed from the theory it had back in the Thurman Arnold days when it cared about the structure and consolidation of an industry. During the 80s and 90s, we cared more about consumer welfare. The theory here is, hey, we don't care how consolidated your business is, as long as you can prove you're making the product cheaper, okay? Well, that's exactly what Tyson Foods' secret recipe was. They industrialized the system. They could make chicken cheaper than ever. So they could show these antitrust people, hey, let us merge, let us buy out competitor after competitor, and we'll make chicken cheaper than ever, which they did until they gained enough market power to act as a monopoly, which is what we see today. After this wave of consolidation, Tyson gained so much of a footprint in the market that it was no longer a subject to the support, the forces of supply and demand in a significant way. And we're going to get into what Tyson has done with that power. But here's, to me, the major dynamic. Monopolies use a playbook that hasn't changed and never will change. They're doing today what they did back in the early 1900s. When you're a monopoly, you gain market power and you use it to suppress what you pay your producers, monopsony power, and then you use it to raise prices on the people who buy your product. Or if you're not directly raising prices, you're cutting corners on quality because you can, because the consumer doesn't have a choice. This is exactly the dynamic that we're seeing playing out in the chicken industry. This is why Tyson was able to squeeze these farmers and put them out of business. The farmers didn't have a choice of who to do business with. And this is why, toward the end of reporting the meat racket, I realized that Tyson could raise prices for consumers, which people hadn't really thought about up until 2012 or 2013. We all assumed that these companies were, beholden to Walmart and Costco and had to push prices down. But I'll never forget, I was interviewing the guy who became CEO of Tyson Foods, Donnie Smith, and his sidekick, Donnie King, who still works there. I was interviewing them in Tyson Foods headquarters in 2011, and they were kind of gleefully describing how they could control thousands of farms from one office in Springdale, and how they could contract production to raise prices when the market got hard. And, there's a sentence in the meat racket that frankly I somewhat regret now, where I said, these companies are so big, they don't have to collude anymore. All these slaughterhouses that used to be independent are now under the ownership of one company that can ratchet back their production to raise prices on consumers. That turned out to be wrong. Let's get to this point. When the meat racket came out in 2014, the meat industry was not happy. The chairwoman of American Hot Dog Council gave the meat racket a 1-star review on Amazon. That really stung. And then they launched a website called Meat Racket Myths, talking about how I had managed to find the 3 angry farmers and interview them for my book. At that exact moment, when Tyson Foods was saying our industry is more competitive than you could ever believe, and the idea we'd raise prices on consumers is insane, at that exact moment, Tyson Foods executives were sending text messages to their supposed competitors, coordinating price hikes on some of the largest wholesalers of chicken in the country. They were actively colluding with one another. We know this now because of an indictment that was handed down last year that contains these text messages. The behavior was frankly audacious. They're large enough to raise prices on consumers, and they also feel like they have enough impunity that they can criminally collude virtually without consequence, which for a long time was the case. Let's talk about the policy framework that these companies operate under. When the meat racket came out, a lot of people were saying, well, so what's the deal? Should we, boycott Tyson? Maybe I shouldn't buy Tyson products. They sound like a bad actor. The reality is we don't really have the choice because the market's so consolidated. If you're eating chicken at a nursing home, a school, a restaurant, you're consuming Tyson's products. And the point is not that Tyson's a bad actor. It is that it is emblematic of a consolidated industry. And I want to make a small point here. When they suppress what they pay farmers, they are actively draining wealth out of rural communities. Raising meat is one of the pillars of the rural economy. When you drain profits out of that part of the rural economy, you are economically suffocating small towns. So, the consequences of this are dire. This is what happens when you consolidate a business, and boycotting these companies, in my mind, was not the answer at all. And what I was saying in 2014 seemed like a kind of wildly unsatisfying answer, but it's the fact that we need a public policy response to this. This isn't a question of trying to, punish a company at the checkout counter at the grocery store. Hey, that game's over. You can't really do it anymore. We need a coordinated public policy approach to examine the structure of our industries and act in a way that restores competition, restores the ability of entrepreneurs in rural America to access what I call sort of a plug and play capitalism, where if you've got a great idea, you can enter a market, compete, win or lose, make money or leave. We don't have that now under this centrally controlled monopolized market. So when we talk about the public policy framework here, let's talk about for a second what existed when this book came out in 2014, the Obama administration entered office under a banner of reform. No kidding. I truly thought I was going to write a sequel to the Meat Racket that was going to document the trust-busting era of modern times, the modern day FDRs or Teddy Roosevelts who came in and broke apart these meat monopolies. Spoiler, that book never happened. The Obama administration held a series of high-profile workshops around the country, which featured the United States Attorney General Eric Holder next to a gentleman named Tom Vilsack, who at the time was Secretary of Agriculture. This was an incredible combination to see Department of Justice and Department of Ag in one room at the same time talking about monopoly power. Short version, the wheels fell off. And I think part of it was there was a difficulty in communicating the ways that antitrust reform could actually stimulate economic growth. The meat companies successfully painted antitrust reform as, big government's fist crushing down prosperity. And the Obama administration reform efforts largely failed. This was vitally important because it emboldened the meat industry, and they realized they can act with impunity, and that monopolies are an accepted part of our modern political economy. I just mentioned the criminal collusion, evidence of which is now being released in court cases. There were other aspects of what these companies were doing. I highly recommend people Google a company called AgriStats, A-G-R-I stats. Companies like Tyson were sharing detailed data with one another about what farmers got paid, for example. So Tyson would get a spreadsheet every month telling it what its competitors were paying farmers. Well, that sure helped Tyson keep its prices low, so those farmers couldn't leave, to get a higher price from a competitor. They were all coordinating in a concrete, systematic way what they would pay farmers. And they used this AgriStats data sharing system to raise prices on consumers in exactly the same way. When I got my first AgriStats report around 2016, the meat industry still has the capacity to shock me after all these years. They get a spreadsheet every month that tells them not just the exact products that their consumers are producing, but the price per pound they charge for it. This is what the spreadsheet they get through AgriStats every month. They get a spreadsheet that shows how many baby chicks their customers, or rather their competitors, are about to place, which helps them coordinate production cuts. It's stunning. I would like to give one more small example of this sort of feeling of impunity that these companies gained after the Obama administration's reform efforts fell apart. There was a recent story out of Iowa at a Tyson Foods pork plant, which showed that managers there not only forced their employees to come into work in the face of a lethal and extraordinarily dangerous virus, they created a betting pool to bet how many people were going to get sick over a given period of time. That's emblematic of a corporate culture that feels impunity and can conduct criminal activities without the worry that there is a cop on the beat. This is why I say things have gotten much, much worse since I reported the book. Let me say, however, that I'm sincere when I say there's a momentum around examining the monopoly problem that didn't exist when the Obama administration frankly failed to execute a reform vision circa 2010, 2011, 2012. There's more energy around it today. It's coming from both the public sector and the private sector, which is fascinating. If there are young folks out there with an interest in antitrust policy, let me say that there is a robust suite of tools and laws that were developed in this space, not 100 years ago, but pretty close, back in the late 30s, to restore competition. This suite of tools is remaining there largely unused. I described antitrust policy in this country as sort of like a marble statue in the middle of a public park that was, pristine when it was raised up, but now it's been worn down by the weather, vandalized and sprayed on with graffiti by the meat industry lobbyists over the decades. But the core of the statute remains. I mean, so many of these core laws and policies on antitrust enforcement remain to be used. And let me please just talk about a couple examples. Antitrust law gives private sector actors the right to sue in civil court when they view antitrust violations. In 2016, over Labor Day weekend, a group of attorneys filed a case that I call the Maple Vale, V-A-L-E case. It's Maple Vale versus a ton of producers. This was the private sector lawsuit that really unveiled what agristats was and how it worked. It charges these companies with collusion and conspiracy to raise prices. It was a watershed lawsuit. Did more to affect the reality of monopoly and competition, I'm sorry to say, than any previous federal action from either the Department of Justice or Congress. What's interesting is that the Trump administration has moved on this. Last year, the United States Department of Justice filed a criminal complaint against the chicken companies for collusion. This is the lawsuit that contained the text messages I was just referencing. I want to be careful with how I phrase this, but I think there's a case to be made that the Trump administration has done more to enforce antitrust laws in agribusiness than the Obama administration ever did. Argue with me if you want, but let's talk about that and think about that. Regardless of who did more, the tide is indeed turning. There is momentum and there is action in this front that there has never been in modern times. And I think it really opens the window, not just to reform and litigation, which I have to say is direly needed for people trying to make a living in rural America, for people trying to manage life today on a limited bill for groceries who depend on this food as a cheap source of protein. Reform is needed to restore competition to this marketplace. And remember, we're not talking about socialism. We are talking about robust capitalism, which I would argue history has shown that robust antitrust enforcement stokes competition, opportunity, capitalism, and widespread prosperity, which is exactly what we saw in rural America. I've met people who put their kids through law school based on raising hogs. Those days are over now, but they didn't happen by accident. Those days happened because the United States had an antitrust framework that valued competition over consolidation and low prices. So, with that in mind, I want to keep this conference on time here. I'm at a half hour, Austin, but we have 7 minutes till the next.
Could you actually take a few questions?
I would be so delighted to take a few questions. I wanted to keep my remarks exactly at 30.
Perfect.
Please,
I have to tell you, my phone's been blowing up during your talk just because people are just adoring what you're saying. I'm going to pass it over to Noah. Noah, can you manage the questions as they come in? I guess just my first question I have for you, Chris, is, where are avenues you wish you could have gone down in the book that you didn't, that you encourage any young journalist, scholar watching right now that they should pursue?
Well, one area I neglected on purpose, I made a choice. the plight of workers in the slaughterhouses is so important, so important. I felt like the story of the farmers had never been told. I felt like there had been a lot of reporting around the exploitation of refugees and immigrant labor at these Tyson Foods plants. In retrospect, I wish I had done a lot more reporting, not just on the exploitation of these workers, but on the sort of the blind eye bargain that our federal government has forged with these companies, particularly back in the 1990s, to not enforce labor laws, to not enforce OSHA laws, to not support labor unions that could give so many of these workers a voice at their workplace. Leah Douglas at Fern, who I know you'll hear from later, has just done incredible reporting about the literal physical danger these workers and their families have been put into because they don't have bargaining power. That's one area that I just think is so important to understand.
Okay.